What if your fight for dignity wasn't against conflict, but against silence and the barriers no one talks about? In Chicago, a city once seen as the gateway to the American dream, you might feel the weight of rising costs, overlooked by a support system stretched thin.
Yes, I've been homeless. Sure have. I've struggled with a lot of events in my life.
Yeah, I do. I feel like we have introspective because they did take down our home before we could clean it out.
You might be someone who helped shape this city, yet now find yourself sleeping in its forgotten corners before you had the chance to say goodbye. This is RoamKind, and this is your invitation to witness a side of Chicago that rarely makes the news. Let's begin. Number 1. The homelessness crisis in Chicago. You might think numbers don't speak, but what if they scream? In Chicago, the wind no longer whispers through the city's iconic skyline. It howls through tents, beneath overpasses, makeshift shelters, in public parks, and around the corners of neighborhoods that time seems to have forgotten. This is not a crisis looming in the future. It is already here. This is the year 2025. According to the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, by the end of the year 2024, more than 18,800 individuals were officially recorded as experiencing literal homelessness. That is 3 times the 6,139 people recorded in 2023. And when we include those doubling up with others due to financial hardship, the total number of people affected by housing insecurity soars to an overwhelming 76,375 in just 1 year. This is not just a statistic. It is the collapse of stability, the quiet dismantling of dignity. Behind each number is a human life, a story, a name, a person lost in a system that once promised protection. "I never thought this would be me," says Angela, a former nursing assistant, now living in her car with her 2 sons. "The rent increased, my hours were reduced, and just like that, we were out." So what is driving this devastating crisis? A severe lack of affordable housing is pushing families out faster than they can find shelter. As property
62-year-old grandmother who's been living in a tent near said, "I worked all my life, and now I have to..."
With low incomes behind. At the same time, wages have stagnated, unable to keep up with the surge in living expenses, especially under the crushing burden of high taxes, utility costs, and medical bills. The termination of support programs established during the pandemic years has unraveled what remained of the safety net. Thousands who once relied on emergency rental assistance, nutrition aid, or expanded healthcare access are now left with nowhere to turn. Adding to the pressure is the growing influx of asylum seekers and displaced individuals, further straining Chicago's already overwhelmed public systems. And then there is the undeniable truth of inequality. Black residents, who make up less than 30% of Chicago's population, represent nearly 50% of those experiencing homelessness, a reflection of long-standing systemic disparities that demand action. But perhaps the most alarming part is not just how many are suffering, it is how rapidly the fabric is unraveling. What once held families above the poverty line has grown dangerously thin, and when the fall comes, it is swift, devastating, and often invisible. "It feels like drowning in slow motion," says Malik, a former factory worker. "You're invisible until you disappear." So, where do we go from here? The homelessness crisis in Chicago is not simply a matter of shelter. It is a test of justice, a measure of public policy, and a mirror held up to our collective responsibility. If the number of people without secure housing has tripled in 1 year, what will the next year bring? The question is no longer, how did we get here? It's what will we choose to do now? Number 2. The weight of taxes and the strain of survival in Chicago. They say only 2 things in life are certain: death and taxes. But here in Illinois, and especially in Chicago, taxes seem to arrive sooner and more often than anyone ever expected. According to the most recent analysis by the Nonpartisan Tax Foundation, Illinois holds the highest combined state and local tax burden in the United States, averaging over $13,100 per household per year. That includes a property tax rate of nearly 1.95%, the second highest in the nation, and a sales tax average of 8.85%, a load that continues to weigh heavily on working families. This isn't just data on paper, it's the daily reality carved into every receipt, rent check, and utility bill, especially for residents in urban centers like Chicago. And for many, that burden is becoming unbearable. A recent Gallup poll revealed that more than 51% of Illinoisans surveyed have seriously considered leaving the state, citing overwhelming taxes as their primary reason. "We pay more, but we seem to get less," says Diana, a single mother from Cook County. "I work 2 jobs and still can't afford groceries without skipping bills." Yet the true cost of this system isn't only measured in dollars. It is felt most deeply in the widening gap between wages and living costs, a quiet force that drives not just economic hardship, but emotional exhaustion. Dr. Karen Patel, an economist with the Midwest Policy Institute, explains, "The structure of Illinois' economy shows a clear imbalance. Taxes remain high, but wage growth continues to lag, especially for low and middle-income households. That divide is widening the poverty line." In Chicago, this imbalance is sharply felt. According to a 2025 Bureau of Labor Statistics report, the average cost of living in the city rose nearly 4% in the past year, while median wages increased by just 1.5%. The result? More working families find themselves trapped, earning too much to qualify for aid, but too little to survive. Every paycheck feels like a lifeline that doesn't quite reach, shares Malik, a part-time delivery driver. "I'm not lazy, I'm just losing a race that keeps moving the finish line." So how much can a family absorb before it breaks? What happens when the cost of staying becomes greater than the cost of leaving? Chicago's tax crisis is not just about policy, it's about people, about pressure, about survival. Unless something changes, more families will be forced to choose between staying rooted or staying afloat. Because when life becomes more expensive than it's worth, the question is no longer how we got here, but how many can still hold on. Do you think high taxes in Chicago are worth the services people get? Just type yes or no. Let's see where we all stand. Number 3. Poverty and inequality in the heart of Chicago. Would you still see this city the same way if you knew that 1 out of every 4 children in Chicago grows up in poverty? This is not a story from a faraway land. This is your own neighborhood. One of America's most iconic cities is facing a crisis that remains largely invisible to the public eye. According to the most recent data from the World Population Review, approximately 16.83% of Chicago's residents live below the poverty threshold. But here's the reality that stings even deeper. 25%, that is, 1 in every 4 children, are raised in homes that struggle to cover basic necessities. This is more than just a statistic. It's a mirror reflecting systemic gaps in opportunity, safety, and human dignity. And this escalating crisis of poverty and unstable housing cannot be reduced to numbers alone. It's about real lives, neighbors, classmates, and families you might walk past today without ever knowing their story. In the year 2025, more than 16,400 students in Chicago's public school system were documented as living without stable housing. That means thousands of children go to school each morning without knowing where they'll sleep that night, let alone how to concentrate enough to learn. You might hear voices like Ava's, a 6th grade student who says, "I keep my backpack by the door because we never know if we'll stay the night." Her family moves between borrowed basements and shelter floors, a reality that too many families know too well. But the truth is, you don't need spreadsheets to understand poverty. You see it in crumbling sidewalks, feel it in empty lunchboxes, and hear it in the quiet of classrooms where anxiety replaces curiosity. Look around. Grocery lines stretch longer, public schools sit abandoned, and public spaces are redesigned to push the unhoused out of sight, as if invisibility could erase need. Research from Howard University reveals something even more critical. Black communities in Chicago disproportionately bear this economic burden. Generational challenges, rising housing costs, stagnant wages, unequal access to healthcare and education build layers of hardship too thick to ignore. So ask yourself, how many times have you walked past these signs and looked the other way? How do you reconcile the glittering skyline with the truth that some children are sleeping in parked cars beneath it? This isn't just about where this crisis began. It's about whether we have the courage to see it and the will to change it. Because behind every number is a name you haven't learned yet. Behind every policy is a life hanging in the balance. And in every shelter and hallway, one truth remains. Poverty and homelessness in Chicago are not accidents. They are the result of systemic choices. So, what will it take for you to truly see and to act? Number 4. Architectural hostility and social isolation. In the heart of Chicago, public space no longer feels like it belongs to you. The bench where you once might have sat is now divided by cold metal bars. The warm air vent you stood near last winter, it's behind a cage. The rain shelter you leaned under is now tilted, not by accident, but by design. These aren't oversights. They're signals that whisper, you weren't meant to stay here. You live in one of the most heavily taxed cities in the United States, with a sales tax of 10.25% and increasing property tax burdens. Yet the very streets you walk tell you something unspoken. You don't belong in this version of the city. These design choices don't just shape sidewalks, they shape experience. And for those already struggling, those without housing, without support, without shelter, every cold surface feels like policy in steel and concrete. Maybe you've seen it. Maybe you've felt it. More than 68,000 people, including families like yours, experienced homelessness in Chicago last year. And instead of seeing inclusive spaces built, you see corners disappear, benches shrink, shelters fade, not to help, but to hide. They don't have to say "go away" out loud, a man once told you. They build the place so it says it for them. And it does. It tells you, don't linger, don't rest, don't be seen. And slowly, you begin to feel it, not just in your body, but in your place in the world. You stop asking for comfort. You stop expecting welcome. Because when public space doesn't recognize you, how long before public policy forgets you? In the year 2025, the city reinstated its 60-day shelter policy, limiting how long you can stay. It's not a home, it's a countdown. So now, every bench, every gate, every tilted roof tells you the same thing, in different language. You can't rest here. You can't belong here. And perhaps your presence isn't acknowledged here. And this, it's no longer just about shelter. It's about your dignity, your visibility, and whether, in this city shaped by so many, you still count as someone who belongs. Number 5, the 60-day rule and the invisible exile. Now imagine it's you, arriving in a new country, clinging to hope, and facing a deadline. 60 days, that's all they give you. 60 days to find a job, a roof over your head, and a new beginning, or disappear into the unknown. Since late 2023, if you arrive in Chicago as a new migrant, you are given just 60 days of temporary shelter. When that time runs out, you're expected to move on, regardless of whether you've found a job, housing, or even basic stability. With few alternatives, you might end up in distant suburbs, far from support, far from help. By early 2025, more than 13,500 people like you had gone through this policy, according to the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, and nearly half face something called secondary displacement, homelessness, all over again. They told me, "Your time is up." I had nowhere to go. No job, no family, just a bag and the winter, said Mateo, a young man from Venezuela. It's not a shelter anymore, it's a countdown. Supporters say the rule helps manage resources, but experts like Dr. Lisa Ayers from the University of Illinois warn that for people like you, it might actually make things worse. Without long-term pathways to settle and grow, she says, you risk being pushed further into the margins. And when that temporary door closes, you don't return to a life, you begin to fight for it. You might find yourself curled up on a church floor, splitting a sandwich under the freeway, or holding tight to a patch of cardboard against the wind. Every night feels like a quiet fight, said Abdul, a refugee from Sudan. Not with violence, but with cold, hunger, and the fear that tomorrow might be colder. This isn't just someone else's crisis, it could be yours. It's not only about shelter, it's about dignity, belonging, and the invisible line between survival and silence. So, if you had only 60 days, could you really begin again? Or would you simply run out of time? Number 6, the struggle for resources and community response. If you walk through today's Chicago, you will feel it, the weight of daily survival pressing down on too many people. You are witnessing a poverty and homelessness crisis that has intensified rapidly. By the end of the year 2024, more than 76,000 people across this city were without a home. Rising rents, shrinking affordable housing, and overburdened support services have created a situation where shelters are full, and you can see the strain everywhere. Even with the city's One System initiative expanding shelter capacity to approximately 6,800 beds, it still is not enough. And if you have ever stood in line at a food pantry or watched someone holding tightly to a blanket on a freezing sidewalk, you know, people are competing just to survive. In fact, in early 2025, food banks across the city reported a 14% increase in demand, an unmistakable sign that hunger is tightening its grip. You may ask yourself, in a city this developed, how did we end up here, where kindness has to compete with desperation? When did the basics of life become something you have to fight for instead of something you're simply granted as a human right? Sure, you have seen efforts, policy reforms, emergency funding, partnerships with non-profit organizations. But the reality on the streets tells a very different story. It raises a deeper question. What kind of city do you want to live in? One that lifts others up, or one where need is met with silence? Because in moments like this, it is not just about programs or policy. It is about you, your neighbors, your community. The way you choose to respond, to act, to care. That is what shapes Chicago's future. And maybe, just maybe, your empathy is exactly what this city needs most right now. Thanks for staying with us. If this story moved you, type "Hope starts here" in the comments. Let's fill this space with something stronger than silence. Solidarity. Segment 7. Chicago. A glimpse into our future society. Chicago is not just a local issue, it may be a preview of what is to come. When simply existing begins to require approval, what will our cities become? Now ask yourself, in the year 2025, could your city become what Chicago already is? A place of contrast, where the skyline rises with promise, but shadows grow longer underneath. More than 68,000 people in Chicago are without housing today, a number that has increased by 14% since the year 2023. This is no longer a distant crisis, it is a warning on your doorstep. You may believe that high taxes support public services, and in theory, they do. But what happens when those very taxes chip away at the stability of families like yours? As prices soar and housing assistance falls short, you might begin to wonder, is security slipping out of reach? In certain districts, policies buried in city budget documents do more than determine where housing can be built. They quietly decide where you can or cannot be if you no longer have a place to live. Cities you know, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, they are not just observing, they are testing the same policies. Public spaces are becoming restricted. Access to shelters often depends on having documentation you may not possess. If everything falls apart, you might think you are safe. But the line between citizen and outsider is far thinner than you imagine. Maria J., who walks these streets every day, once said, "This is not just about shelter. We want dignity. We want to be acknowledged as part of the city." Her voice could be yours, or someone you love. So take a moment, pause, and reflect. This is not only about what is happening, it is about who makes the decisions and who bears the consequences. Could it be you, or someone just like you, carrying that burden quietly beneath rules never written with your name in mind? When the simple act of being present in public becomes something you must justify, what happens to the soul of the places you call home? Let Chicago be more than a headline. Let it be your wake-up call. Number 8. Government policies and public response. Chicago, a city of towering skylines and deep cultural roots. But behind the mirrored glass and shimmering lakefront, a quieter, colder story unfolds. It's not written in the headlines. It's in the plastic bags, the parking meters, and the monthly streaming subscriptions, each now just a little more expensive, not for luxury, but to keep the city running. In October 2024, the city of Chicago approved a $17.1 billion budget for the year 2025, avoiding increases in property taxes, but turning instead to other forms of revenue. A 7-cent tax on each plastic bag, a broadened digital services tax, higher fees for parking and rideshare services, and possibly coming soon, a 1% grocery tax propose to cover a projected $80 million deficit in 2026 once the statewide grocery tax expires. These might seem like small figures, but when you are counting every dollar, every cent matters. That grocery trip suddenly costs more. Not enough to collapse your budget, but enough to cut into your choices. 7 cents might not sound like much to you, says Mariah Jenkins, a mother from Englewood, but that's 7 cents I no longer have for my baby's milk. If you've ever faced the choice between bus fare and a meal, between rent and medicine, then you know these taxes are not just policy. They are pressure, constant, unseen, relentless. Behind every policy is a person, like you, trying to make ends meet. According to the United States Census Bureau, more than 16.5% of households in this city live under the poverty line, and homelessness has increased by 12% in the last year, now affecting more than 68,000 people. These aren't just statistics, they're the stories under highway bridges and beside quiet churches, stacked like snow. Cold, quiet, heavy. They're not just taxing our wallets, says David, once unhoused. They're taxing our will to hope. City officials call it necessary. We are not cutting services, one council member said. We are doing what we can. There are no painless options left. But you know, not all pain is shared equally. While some neighborhoods gain investments, parks and bike lanes, others, maybe yours, face broken schools, rising rents, and grocery stores that vanish overnight. Dr. Rachel Song, policy researcher at DePaul University, puts it plainly: when you tax everyday essentials, you don't just raise revenue, you deepen the divide between those who thrive and those just trying to survive. So what kind of future are you being asked to fund? And more importantly, who gets to be part of it? Because in the end, this isn't just about taxes, it's about you. Will you keep passing by, or stop, listen, and choose to care? What's going through your mind after hearing all of this? To me, this isn't just about numbers. It's about people being pushed aside in the name of policy. A city where existence feels like a countdown, where public spaces exclude and survival becomes a competition. Are we witnessing a housing crisis or a crisis of compassion? I don't have all the answers, but I believe we need to talk about this, to question the systems, and to ask, what kind of city do we want to live in? Share your thoughts in the comments. Should cities rethink how they treat the vulnerable, or are we just managing decline? Thanks for watching RoamKind. If this touched you, please share, because awareness is the first step to change.